The summer sun beat down mercilessly upon the stone walls of Beziers in July of the year 1209. Thousands of terrified citizens huddled inside the Cathedral of Saint Nazaire, hoping for divine protection against the army gathering outside. This was not a foreign invader seeking land or gold, but a force sanctioned by the highest religious authority in Europe. The Crusaders waiting beyond the gates wore the cross of Christ upon their chests, yet they prepared to slaughter fellow Christians in his name. Tension filled the stagnant air as the besieging army led by northern French barons prepared their siege engines. The silence before the storm was heavy with the promise of impending doom and bloodshed. What transpired in the Languedoc region of southern France was not merely a military campaign, but a war for the very soul of Christendom. The Catholic Church faced a spiritual crisis that threatened its absolute authority over the spiritual lives of Europeans. A dualist movement known as Catharism had taken deep root in the wealthy and independent lands of the South. These believers rejected the material world as evil and denied the sacraments of the Catholic Church. If this heresy were allowed to spread unchecked, it could unravel the entire ecclesiastical hierarchy that held medieval society together. The stakes were nothing less than the total dominance of the papacy and the political unification of the French kingdom. At the center of this gathering storm stood Pope Innocent III, a man of immense intellect and unyielding will. He viewed the Cathar heresy as a cancer that had to be excised to save the body of the Church. For years he had sent legates and preachers to debate the heretics, but words had failed to turn the tide. Now he turned to the sword. Opposite him in this conflict was Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, one of the most powerful lords in France. Raymond was a man of culture and tolerance who ruled over a land where Jews and heretics lived openly alongside Catholics. His reluctance to persecute his own subjects would bring the wrath of Rome down upon his head. The prosperous region of Languedoc was unlike the grim and feudal north of France. It was a land of troubadours and courtly love, where the sun shone bright on vineyards and bustling trade cities. The nobility here spoke Occitan and felt little loyalty to the distant King of France in Paris. In this open environment, the Cathar faith found fertile ground among both the nobility and the common people. They called themselves good Christians and lived lives of extreme asceticism that contrasted sharply with the perceived corruption and excess of the Catholic clergy. This moral contrast made them dangerous to the established order. The Cathars believed in two gods, with one being a good god of the spirit and the other an evil god of the material world. They believed that human souls were trapped in physical bodies, which were creations of the evil deity. To them, Jesus was a spirit who only appeared to be human and therefore never truly died on the cross. These radical beliefs struck at the very foundation of Christian theology. The Catholic Church could not tolerate a rival faith that claimed the material world, and the Church itself were tools of Satan. The theological divide was too vast to be bridged by negotiation. Tensions reached a breaking point in January of the year 1208. The papal legate Pierre de Castelnau had spent months trying to bully Count Raymond into suppressing the heresy. After a heated argument, Pierre was murdered by a servant of the Count as he crossed the Rhone River. While Raymond denied ordering the assassination, the Pope saw his chance to act. Innocent III declared Raymond a murderer and a heretic. He issued a bull calling for a crusade against the lands of Languedoc, offering the same spiritual indulgences as a crusade to the Holy Land. The time for diplomacy had ended. The call to crusade resonated deeply with the ambitious barons of northern France. They saw an opportunity not only to earn salvation, but to seize the rich lands of the south. A vast army assembled at Lyon, fueled by religious zeal and the promise of plunder. This was a unique moment in history, where a holy war was declared against people within Europe itself. The Crusaders were a mix of knights, mercenaries, and pilgrims, all united under the banner of the cross. They began their march down the Rhone Valley, moving like a plague of locusts toward the lands of Count Raymond. Leading this formidable host was a minor noble who would soon become the face of the crusade. Simon de Montfort was a warrior of frightening competence and unwavering piety. He was a veteran of the Fourth Crusade and a man who believed himself to be an instrument of divine will. Unlike the great counts and dukes who sought land, Simon sought the total eradication of heresy. His military genius would prove to be the undoing of the southern lords. He was ruthless in battle and unshakable in his conviction that God was guiding his hand. The Crusader army arrived at the city of Beziers on that fateful day in July. The city was a mix of Catholics and Cathars living side by side. When the Crusaders demanded that the city leaders hand over the heretics, the citizens refused to betray their neighbors. They believed their walls were strong enough to withstand a siege. However, skirmish at the gates quickly escalated into a full-scale assault. The camp followers and mercenaries of the Crusade breached the walls before the main army had even formed up. The city was defenseless against the wave of violence that followed. It was during this chaotic sack that the papal legate Arnaud Amalric reportedly uttered the infamous command. When asked how the soldiers should distinguish the Catholics from the heretics, he is said to have replied, "Kill them all, for God will know his own." Whether or not these exact words were spoken, the actions of the Crusaders reflected the sentiment perfectly. The slaughter was indiscriminate and total. Men, women, and children were cut down where they stood. The Cathedral of Saint Nazaire offered no sanctuary as the doors were smashed open and those inside were butchered. The massacre at Beziers sent a shockwave of terror throughout the entire region. The smoke from the burning city could be seen for miles, a grim warning to any who would resist the soldiers of Christ. The Crusaders had made their point with brutal efficiency. Terror was their weapon, and they wielded it without mercy. Towns and castles that might have resisted now opened their gates in fear. The psychological impact of Beziers paved the way for the rapid advance of the Crusader army toward their next major target. The next prize was the mighty fortress city of Carcassonne. It stood high on a hill protected by double walls and formidable towers. Inside was the young Viscount Raymond, Roger Trencavel, a popular leader who had given sanctuary to many fleeing Cathars. The siege began in the heat of August, and the conditions were grueling for both sides. The Crusaders cut off the water supply to the city, forcing the defenders into a desperate situation. Disease began to spread within the crowded walls as the summer heat intensified the suffering of the people. Realizing that his people could not survive a long siege, Trencavel rode out to negotiate. He hoped to secure safe passage for his citizens in exchange for surrendering the city. However, the Crusaders betrayed the rules of chivalry and seized him as a prisoner. With their leader captured, the spirit of the defenders broke. The citizens of Carcassonne were allowed to leave the city, but they had to depart wearing only their shirts, carrying nothing of their wealth. The Crusaders took possession of the empty city and the vast riches it contained. With the fall of Carcassonne, the Crusade had established a permanent foothold in the south. The captured lands needed a new ruler, and the northern barons elected Simon de Montfort as the new Viscount. This appointment transformed the conflict from a raid into a war of conquest. Simon now had to hold these lands against a hostile population that viewed him as a foreign tyrant. He established garrisons and began a systematic campaign to root out the heretics and suppress any resistance. The war was far from over. For the next several years, Simon de Montfort waged a relentless campaign across the Languedoc. He moved from castle to castle, laying siege to mountain strongholds where the Cathars had taken refuge. The terrain was rugged and the resistance was fierce. The southern lords, who had initially been divided, now began to unite against the northern invaders. They saw their culture and their independence being stripped away by these French-speaking occupying forces. It became a guerrilla war of ambushes and surprise attacks. One of the most tragic episodes occurred at the town of Minerve in the year 1210. The town was a major Cathar stronghold perched on a steep gorge. After a 6-week siege, during which the Crusaders destroyed the water cisterns with catapults, the defenders surrendered. Simon de Montfort gave the Cathars a choice. They could convert to Catholicism or face the fire. 140 perfecti, the spiritual elite of the Cathars, refused to renounce their faith. They were burned alive in a massive pyre beneath the castle walls. The brutality continued at the siege of Lavore the following year. The town was defended by Dame Jurod, a noblewoman known for her kindness and charity. When the town fell, the Crusaders showed no mercy. They threw Dame Jurod into a well and stoned her to death. Her brother and 80 knights were hanged. 400 Cathars were burned in the largest single execution of the Crusade. These atrocities were intended to break the spirit of the South, but they only served to deepen the hatred for the Crusaders. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse had tried to navigate a middle path, but he could no longer remain neutral. The demands of the church legates became impossible to meet, and he was excommunicated once again. He realized that his only hope lay in military resistance. He called upon his brother-in-law King Peter II of Aragon for aid. Peter was a hero of Christendom who had recently defeated the Moors in Spain. He was a Catholic king, but he feared the growing power of France on his northern border. The entry of Peter II of Aragon into the war changed the dynamic completely. The southern forces now had a powerful monarch to lead them. In September of the year 1213, a massive coalition army led by Peter and Raymond besieged the Crusader garrison at Muret. Simon de Montfort was trapped inside the town with a much smaller force. It seemed that the crusade was doomed. The southern army outnumbered the Crusaders significantly, and victory appeared certain for the King of Aragon. However, Simon de Montfort was a tactician of genius. He noticed that the besieging army was disorganized and overconfident. Instead of waiting to be starved out, he ordered a surprise cavalry charge out of the gates. The Crusader knights smashed into the enemy lines with devastating force. In the chaos of the battle, King Peter II was isolated and killed. The death of the king caused panic among the Aragonese troops, and the southern army collapsed. The Battle of Muret was a miraculous victory for the Crusaders. The victory at Muret consolidated Montfort's control over the south. Count Raymond fled to England, and the Crusaders occupied Toulouse. It seemed that the distinct culture of the Languedoc was destined to be extinguished. The church held a great council at the Lateran Palace in Rome, where they stripped Raymond of his lands and granted them to Simon de Montfort. The northern baron was now the most powerful man in the south, recognized by the Pope as the champion of the faith. Yet the spirit of resistance in Toulouse was not dead. In the year 1217, while Simon was campaigning elsewhere, Raymond returned from exile. The people of Toulouse rose up in joy and expelled the French garrison. They hastily rebuilt the walls that had been torn down. When Simon de Montfort returned, he found the city defiant. He laid siege to Toulouse once again, vowing to destroy it completely this time. The siege dragged on for months with heavy fighting around the walls. Fate intervened in June of the year 1218. As Simon de Montfort rode around the city walls inspecting the siege, engines, a stone launched from a mangonel inside the city struck him on the head. The projectile was reportedly fired by a crew of women and girls defending their home. The ruthless leader of the crusade was killed instantly. His death marked a turning point in the war. Without his terrifying presence, the Crusader army lost its momentum and began to disintegrate. Simon's son Amory de Montfort tried to carry on his father's work, but he lacked the military brilliance of the elder Montfort. The southern lords rallied and began to reclaim their lands. By the year 1224, the Crusaders had been driven out of almost all the territory they had conquered. It seemed for a moment that the Languedoc had survived the storm. However, the French crown had been watching events closely. The King of France saw an opportunity to annex the south permanently. King Louis VII of France launched a new royal crusade in the year 1226. This was no longer just a war of barons, but a war of the state. The royal army was vast and well-funded. The exhausted southern lords could not stand against the full might of the French kingdom. City after city surrendered without a fight. The independence of the South was effectively crushed under the weight of the royal administration. The distinct culture of the troubadours was being suffocated by the bureaucracy of Paris. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris in the year 1229. Count Raymond VII, the son of the old count, was forced to sign a humiliating peace. He agreed to marry his daughter to the brother of the French king, ensuring that his lands would eventually pass to the French crown. He also agreed to hunt down the remaining Cathars. The political conquest was complete, but the religious persecution was about to enter a new and darker phase. To root out the remaining heretics who had gone underground, the church established a new institution known as the Inquisition. Dominican friars were sent into the villages to question everyone from the nobility to the peasantry. They kept detailed records and used fear and imprisonment to extract confessions. The Cathars could no longer live openly. They hid in forests and caves, protected only by a dwindling network of sympathizers. The Inquisition was methodical and relentless in its pursuit. The final stand of the Cathar Church took place at the remote mountain fortress of Montsegur. Perched atop a sheer rock pog, it was known as the safe haven for the perfecti. For years it stood as a symbol of resistance against the Pope and the King. In the year 1243, a royal army surrounded the mountain. The siege lasted for 10 months through a bitter winter. The defenders held out against impossible odds, hoping for a miracle that never came. In March of the year 1244, the garrison at Montsegur surrendered. The terms were similar to those at Minerve decades earlier. The defenders could leave if they abjured their faith. Over 200 perfecti refused to renounce their beliefs. They were led down the mountain to a large stockade filled with wood and brush. They walked willingly into the flames, holding hands and singing hymns. The fall of Montsegur marked the effective end of organized Catharism in the Languedoc. The Albigensian Crusade had succeeded in its terrible goals. The heresy was extinguished, and the south of France was brought under the control of the French crown. The cost was immense. Hundreds of thousands of people had died, and a vibrant culture had been destroyed. The open and tolerant society of the Languedoc was replaced by the rigid orthodoxy of the north. The songs of the troubadours faded into silence, replaced by the prayers of the inquisitors. The legacy of this conflict shaped the future of France and Europe. It established the precedent that the Pope could declare holy war against internal enemies of the Church. It created the machinery of the Inquisition, which would be used for centuries to enforce religious conformity. It also unified France geographically, creating the hexagonal shape of the modern nation. But it remains a scar on the history of the Church, a reminder of the violence that can be unleashed in the name of faith. Today, the ruins of the Cathar castles still stand on the craggy peaks of the Pyrenees. They are silent witnesses to the tragedy that unfolded 8 centuries ago. The wind that blows through the empty windows of Montsegur seems to carry the whispers of those who died for their beliefs. The Albigensian Crusade serves as a somber lesson about the dangers of fanaticism and the fragility of tolerance. It asks us to remember the victims of a war where the lines between righteousness and cruelty were hopelessly blurred. Was the suppression of the Cathars a necessary defense of Christian unity, or a brutal land grab disguised as piety? The answer lies in the ashes of Beziers and the records of the Inquisition. The victors wrote the history, but the memory of the vanquished endures in the folklore of the South. The blood spilled in the Languedoc watered the roots of the French state, but it also stained the moral authority of the medieval church forever. As we look back on these dark events, we see the terrifying power of ideology to dehumanize the other. The Crusaders believed they were doing God's work while they committed unspeakable atrocities. The Cathars believed the world was evil and accepted death with frightening calm. In the clash of these two absolute certainties, common humanity was the first casualty. The whisper of time tells us that such conflicts are never truly about God, but about power control and the fear of difference. The Albigensian Crusade remains one of the most brutal chapters in European history. It was a war that pitted neighbor against neighbor and faith against faith. It demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of organized persecution. Yet in the courage of those who refuse to bow to tyranny, we find a flicker of light in the darkness. Their story is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit, even in the face of annihilation.